the problem is we always think that we can just have one silver bullet that's going to make us secure. It's not, but there's a few things that we can do that can make us considerably harder. So I don't want everyone just to sort of, throw in the towel and go home. There is absolutely a way to face this threat even in 2026.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Hey folks, greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain. Joining us today is Glenn Maiden. He's Chief Security Officer and Director of Threat Intelligence at Fortinet Australia and New Zealand. Glenn brings with him more than 20 years experience across defence, intelligence and enterprise cybersecurity, and now leads efforts to help organisations better understand and defend against today's evolving cyber threats. In addition, Glenn is also the Chief Security Officer for Crime Stoppers International. So there's a lot going on there. Great to have you on the show, Glenn. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for having me, Paul. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Looking forward to delving in and really hearing some of your insights on cybersecurity currently, what that looks like with the landscape of war in Iran and other things going on, although, we hear that something's been signed off, but I know there have been things going on in that part of the world and, data centers at risk and undersea cables, all sorts there. So looking forward to your insights. And of course, we'll be delving into some of the tech news of the week as well. So looking forward to that. Before we jump in, of course, a big thank you to our show partners, to Spark, One New Zealand, 2 Degrees, Workday, Fortinet, PwC and Gorilla Technology. So thank you for the support of the show from Fortinet, and of course appreciation to our other show partners as well, not only for supporting the New Zealand Tech Podcast, but for what all our partners do for the broader tech and innovation ecosystems in New Zealand. Well, first up on the New Zealand front, we've heard from TUANZ, the Technology Users Association of New Zealand today, and they're urging for cross-party agreement on a long-term national cybersecurity strategy in order to help unlock New Zealand's digital potential. Now, they warn that the short political cycles that we have in New Zealand, so we're rolling over a new government every 3 years, and then, a chunk of that is election cycle. So in reality, there's not that much time, in between. So they're saying, look, these short political cycles risk underinvestment, despite some good infrastructure, skills, and renewable energy, foundations. We need to do better to be able to compete globally and to, drive growth. And of course, cybersecurity is a part of that picture as well. What are your thoughts coming from, you obviously, are across both New Zealand and Australia, but you're based very close to Canberra, so I'm sure you're probably following what happens on the Australian government side a bit closer, and you've got the 4-year election cycle over there. What do you think around this approach of kind of a unified guidance? Because what TUANZ are suggesting here, they're basically working on recommendations that I guess the hope is that become adopted nationally from both sides, depending on where the government goes, so that we don't have that kind of flip-flopping change.
I think I listened to a podcast, and it wasn't as good as yours, Paul. It was an inferior podcast, but the guest on it was AI expert, and they just said, well, we had the Industrial Revolution, and we had 100 years to get from point A to point B and be able to get our society to be able to understand what it means, embrace the technology, and then adapt. What this particular gentleman was saying was, with AI, it's going to be 10 times the impact of the Industrial Revolution in about a tenth of the time. So we've really got about 10 years now for our entire world to change absolutely exponentially. So I think this advice is probably it has a lot of merit. It's very, very insightful. So I think given the rate of change, I mean, there would need to be a level of flexibility to be able to adapt as the technology changes so quickly with Moore's Law and stuff. But I do really, really like the idea of a country like New Zealand and Australia, of course, as well, but looking at where some of our competitive advantages and investing in some really long-term infrastructure. So whether that's making sure we've got, additional undersea cables or additional fibre connecting up the main technology parts of New Zealand, or whether it's data centres, as we were talking about before. But I think building some of those foundational national assets is a fantastic idea. And some of these things, if we get started now and we've got a few years' work ahead of us, it should be very, very valuable for a future and maybe only a couple of years in the future as things change so quickly.
Yeah, well, I think, if we were to say compare New Zealand to Australia, and us Kiwis do this from time to time, and let's just pick the broadband for instance. Here in New Zealand, and that was something where one government kicked it off. We're going to roll out fibre to initially 75% of homes, but that was something that the successive governments sort of stayed the course and invested in. And I would argue we got a pretty good result on that front. With 87% of the population now able to get fibre. We probably don't need to talk about the Australian one and how much was spent on that, but you guys caught up in the end, right?
I still think. And again, I'm happy to be honest about it. I think that was what massive lost opportunity for Australia in some of the ways that a huge asset like that could have been politicised and not realised the way that it should have been. So you're right, we're getting there now. I live on a farm about half an hour from Canberra. I'm using Starlink. I shouldn't be. I'm half an hour away from a capital city. So again, goes back to your point. Let's have a look and see what's really, really important and for the nation, not for the political party of the day.
Yeah, but these things are hard, I guess, is the reality. And yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what TUANZ come out with. I think even an independent organisation like this coming up with something, very hard to maybe get agreement, right across the board on everything. But I think it's a great initiative. But yeah, the lesson I would pick would be the ultra fast broadband initiative in New Zealand versus the national broadband network in Australia, because in New Zealand we really did have that consistent support from both sides, and it was ultimately an excellent outcome.
Yes, and I think countries like ours, we even though you're a bit smaller than Australia, but we do have a very geographically dispersed population. So having some of that connecting tissue, even if it's digital tissue these days, is absolutely critical for the health and well-being of a bunch of people that are very, very far away from potentially health services or education services and things like that. So yeah, this is an investment in the country, not in nothing else.
Yeah. Now, on to things on a global front. Anthropic has suspended its new Claude Fable 5 and Mythos 5 models following a US government directive over potential security risks linked to jailbreaking. The move highlights escalating concerns around AI models, cyber capabilities, geopolitical control, and the real-world risks of increasingly powerful models. I'm picking this as something you're probably watching reasonably closely because it's so deeply connected to the world of cyber, isn't it?
It is. So I think when Mythos came out, I think that surprised a lot of people in terms of just how capable it is. I think a lot of people still don't have the full picture in terms of what it can and can't do and what's real and what's not. But my view is the way that's panned out has panned out the best way possible that could have panned out. So Fortinet, we're part of Project Glasswing. Mythos has been shared with us for quite some time now, so we're using it to make sure that all of our products are as secure as possible and resistant to potentially AI vulnerability assessment and exploitation. So to me, I think that was a really, really optimal outcome for something that could have maybe been a lot worse than that. I think with the new banning of some of these technologies overseas, I look back many, many years ago when there was a whole bunch of encryption protocols and encryption algorithms that were not allowed to be exported from the US because they had export controls on them. So I think that this is probably similar, and you could argue it's probably not ideal for us, but probably trying to keep a little bit of a handle on some of those technologies until we can understand just how capable they are and some of the implications. I know certainly from a cyber perspective, I should say, we've seen even just Gen AI models where I can't talk a Gen AI model into doing something illegal. But what the bad guys have done is said, well, I'm just going to create my own Gen AI model. So whether that's Worm GPT or Fraud GPT or some of these other models that don't have those guardrails. So, maybe if there is some really, really critical technology like that, this is not a bad thing necessarily for the world.
Yeah, and I think the concerns around jailbreaking that, bad actors, can manipulate the models to do things that in theory they're not supposed to do, but because, we haven't, seen all of the risks with prompt injection and so on addressed, there is that risk sitting in the background that actually Anthropic can't completely control their own models, and that's probably the same for all of the companies, right? So it is a absolutely fascinating time to be alive. I did, like you, I thought that, Project Glasswing, the making available of the new models to some specific partners by Anthropic to be able to address cybersecurity issues before the models were released more broadly. That sounded either really good or good PR spin, but I think to me it was more than some sort of publicity trick. It seems like genuinely, the new models are a step up, and they were able to find a whole lot of vulnerabilities. So this is going to be quite a challenging one to probably solve over the next little while, because as a new model comes out, it tends to get mimicked and kind of copied, and then you'll see sort of open source models from varying places and so on, effectively match what the most cutting edge models do within a period of months, right? So it is I think a significant challenge, and I'm not quite sure where to from here. Obviously Anthropic have really sort of pushed back on the US government and saying this doesn't make sense, but yeah, I'm not sure we have the perfect answer. And from what we've been hearing from the leaders across the key Gen AI platforms, they all hold some significant concerns around the future of AI and significant risks. So in some ways it's actually pleasing that there is at least some government intervention that isn't just saying, hey, go for gold, do whatever you like. We're never going to say no to anything.
I mean, maybe I'm getting a bit more conservative in my older days, but I think the old principle that information wants to be free holds true. So I think until we can actually understand. Actually, and if I step back a bit, one of the things that I've seen over the last couple of years is, obviously there's been some really clever AI models, some absolutely mind-bending AI models. But one thing that stood out to me is just the innovative use of some of these models by normal people, but also by cyber criminals as well. So I think just until we actually understand what that capability is and what risk that's bringing to businesses here in New Zealand and broader, I think just maybe keeping it a little bit close to the chest is not necessarily a bad thing, at least temporarily.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it creates a whole new situation we haven't seen before when governments are able to shut down, an AI model, and effectively this is what's happened on a global basis. I think it also highlights the concerns around AI being used by bad actors as a cybersecurity weapon. And I think we'll definitely stir up some tensions around tech sovereignty. We've talked about data sovereignty often in years gone by, but we haven't thought of the sovereignty from an AI perspective to the same degree in terms of who has control over the AI models, which takes us into our next story, which is around SpaceX. They've had their initial public offering on the NASDAQ over the weekend, and part of what they're doing, their big sell is about data centers in space. Now, if you kind of cross these two things over, what sort of control would there be if the data centers that were housing these AI models were sitting in space? You know, you could potentially have companies that are pushing back on their local governments and going, well, that's outside of your jurisdiction. It's sitting in space, and we will do what we like. Do you think that's a possibility?
This sounds like a Pandora's box, Paul. I mean, I think the interesting part, and going back to your previous question about the Anthropic and banning the export of that technology to certain countries, if you think about what that could mean, now, from a realistic perspective, it's only a couple of their models that they're banned that are sort of very, very high-end models. But I think, as countries like Australia and New Zealand, and we're a long way away from everywhere else, so as we start to become more and more dependent on whether it's not even just AI, but certainly with software as a service and, the big hyperscalers and those sort of things, what would it actually mean if we did have, so whether it was a political or a physical event that had that cable cut, or in the case as in your example now, whether it was a data center in space, if we had that beam interrupted, what would that mean? Would that mean that we can no longer operate on someone in hospital? If you think in a couple of years the surgeon's going to be sitting in Auckland, operating on someone down in Dunedin or something like that, all of a sudden that whole business model and all the efficiencies we've gained from technology over many, many years have been undermined. So it's absolutely something that we need to think about, not just in terms of, I guess, that one model, but if we think of everything as one massive big mesh of interconnected systems, what is the effect if I cut one link here? What does it actually mean for, my 80-year-old mother that's getting operated on tomorrow in Dunedin, or something bad happens?
This is part of the flip side, isn't it? Is when these things get blocked or banned, it's hard to necessarily know what the flow-on effect might be. I mean, I was impacted. I was using, one of these models over the weekend, and I was wondering why I had some errors on the screen. And it's a weekend; it wasn't nothing too critical, but some hours later, I pick up the news and realised, oh, here's what's going on. It's not just
at least it wasn't user error.
Yeah. At least it's not just me. Everyone else around the world was in exactly the same boat. But certainly, if it was something critical in terms of somebody's health, and the models have been relied on, and I think this is one of the aspects of AI is the models keep changing quite quickly, and things need to be designed in such a way that they can fail gracefully, and that there are alternatives to be able to lean on if issues arise, and even just the reality that a model won't be around for it's not going to stick around for 5 years. It's just not that sort of thing's not happening anymore. Whereas we've got quite used to bit of software. You installed that on might be 20-year-old software. You might still be able to run it on a current machine in some cases, right? But that isn't going to be the case probably anytime soon. I was just going to say,
if you've got any listeners here that are in configuration management, your life is about to get a whole lot more painful. My apologies in advance. And change control as well. Change control is the other part of it. Not there's big implications from cybersecurity, but how can you maintain a really, really solid change control system when essentially these models you're consuming as a service are changing all the time? It's
there's a lot to delve into here. So when it comes to the SpaceX initial public offering, this has been the largest ever IPO in history. It's landed at a time when we've got this huge AI-fueled market boom and really intense investor demand. So, I guess what we saw at the IPO, where they put $75 billion US dollars worth of shares on the market, is that's turned upward, and anyone that was able to jump in right at the get go has ended up with a positive lift. Just having even a quick look, so as the share market's been operating today, another 20 looks like, including sort of after hours trading, 23% increase in that stock. So we're now looking at a market cap for SpaceX of 2.5 trillion US dollars,
trillionaire,
which is nuts, right? That's north of Elon's the first trillionaire, and north of 4 trillion if you put that in New Zealand dollar terms. So biggest IPO in history. A lot of people that have jumped in behind this, and I guess it's that sort of combination of their AI data center offerings, AI and space, alongside the existing business that's got people excited. But I think there's probably some significant tension here in terms of, if they don't pull off what they're aiming to, then that valuation is potentially way too high. If they do pull it off, then who knows? Is it too low?
The sky's the limit, or maybe even the sky's not the limit with SpaceX.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't something I was jumping into to invest in myself. But I can understand why so many people have been attracted to it. But I think it's one of those stocks that potentially carries a significant amount of risk. And on the flip side, if it goes well, maybe, as some people are suggesting, they end up as a $10 trillion business.
Yeah, I'm for anyone listening, do not take any investment advice from me. That's the last thing you want to do. But I do think that in the case of SpaceX, I actually agree with all your points there. There's definitely some risk there, but they seem to be a very innovative, iterative, fast-moving company. Like there's a lot that they're doing, which is really, really exciting. So I guess from a financial perspective, then that's not for me to comment. I've got no idea.
That's not the purpose of the show. So and I guess also we should mention there's a bit of a story here with Rocket Lab as well. Incredible and innovative New Zealand / American space business. And at the same time as SpaceX were doing their IPO, we heard that Rocket Lab have entered the NASDAQ 100 index. And, of course, SpaceX will land on that as well. And what that means is for, those that are, got KiwiSavers and varying other sort of investments, then they may well end up with a slice of SpaceX and now a slice of Rocket Lab in their portfolios because of the way that these indexes work and how investments go against those top companies. So I think that certainly got a few people kind of excited on the Rocket Lab side, and of course a lot of Kiwis are following with interest. I think we've seen stats suggesting something like 32,000 New Zealanders have Rocket Lab shares. Fantastic. So. And I think there's a lot of interest in seeing Rocket Lab's continued success.
It's good to see the Kiwis keeping the fight alive with the Americans.
Yeah. Well, definitely, because we're not getting too much competition on the Australian front at the moment.
You're not.
So we're pretty happy on that front. Now, another story that crossed my path that I thought we should touch on. And this is one that could become a deep rabbit hole, which I probably today we won't do that. But New Scientist have published a story, and their report claims that fully autonomous AI drones killed soldiers during a Ukrainian battlefield test 2 years ago. The drones apparently independently targeted and destroyed enemies without human oversight, marking a controversial milestone and raising some very significant ethical, legal and accountability concerns about autonomous warfare. And I guess when you think about that, having no human oversight or visibility, with the drones apparently operated without communication, without there being a video feed with somebody external making or having that opportunity for any sort of intervention, we have a big challenge. And that also, as well as those sort of ethical concerns about that, you end up with, well, who's legally liable? Is it the manufacturer of the equipment? Is it the country that sort of initiated the attack? Is it an individual that programmed it? That's pretty challenging. Now they have said that, look, the evidence is limited, and we don't have any sort of verification from Ukraine's Ministry of Defence or any kind of official parties. But this is a sort of thing that's been talked about for decades, isn't it? And now we're hearing that maybe at least in a test scenario that there have been folks that have been killed in this manner.
Am I going to be the first person on this podcast to mention Skynet? Maybe, maybe not. But I mean, it's absolutely terrifying. Again, like with a lot of these AI instances where we don't fully know exactly what's going on underneath, even the developers that are actually building these systems. So yeah, there's a million ways that it could go wrong. The flip side of that, though, also is if we're going to be honest with ourselves, this is probably the future of warfare. So a whole bunch of tactical, operational, and strategic level drone platforms is where the world's heading, whether we like it or not. All with some level of AI embedded capability to at least some degree. So I guess we're going to have to start to come to terms with it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my feeling is, well, we've got the technology, like we've got somewhat autonomous cars, we've got autonomous tools from a cybersecurity perspective and so on. But when we're talking about taking people's lives, is this an area that should be sacrosanct, and then there needs to be some sort of global agreement, and it's not unique to have legal restraints around certain things in a war type context. So yeah, this to me seems like something that probably needs some serious thought. But yeah, I mean I agree. I think if there is no agreement or laws in place otherwise, then that we will move to very much to a world where, I mean, this is just the natural progression of things. So I'm kind of hopeful that doesn't happen. Right,
it could be a good thing. I mean, going back to my defence days, you've got international laws of armed conflict, and unfortunately they're not always adhered to. But most countries, and certainly Australia was one of them, you would be doing battle damage assessments before any particular campaign, so you didn't hit a school or you didn't hit a mosque or didn't hit a church or whatever it is. So if you think from an AI perspective, there is the opportunity to introduce some very, very, very hard guardrails where that may eliminate human error and I guess hopefully have less innocent bystanders be killed. And I know if you take it back to, you mentioned the autonomous cars, I know I heard Elon say once, I don't have to have the best, I don't have to have it perfect. I don't have to have it so it never has a crash, but I just need to get it to the point where it's better than the best driver in the world. So maybe there is a glass half full element to this as well, as long as we can trust countries to use technology like this responsibly.
It's a good point, actually, and definitely an area that I think will be quite controversial. And, when we don't understand how, a particular type of technology works, it can be pretty hard to have, confidence, particularly in an area like this. So, but, no doubt there are lots of people, thinking and working on how to leverage artificial intelligence within these sort of contexts in a manner that yields the most positive results and minimises the downsides.
I know you didn't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I did a presentation yesterday and I had a video in it of the MIT robot dog.
Oh, yeah.
So there was a country now has developed a version of that, but with a machine gun mounted to the top. And I was just thinking, if I was a soldier running around, like that'd be pretty hard to get away from. So yeah, there's some of these innovative AI-enabled capabilities is going to absolutely change the nature of war.
Yeah, well, I mean, you get into an environment where you do have you've got those sort of robots out in the field, as obviously in the sky already. Whether it be parts of the Middle East or whether it be Ukraine or. And so, we expect that these sorts of progressions that we've seen examples of will continue, sort of for better or for worse. But I hope that we can get the balance right. And I don't know, there is a perfect balance ever when it comes to war, to be fair. But that there will be good good debate on these things, and of course, the ultimate is that we don't ever have war. But I think while there's humans on this earth, we will see conflict in one form or another.
I think the interesting thing for me is if you look back, I mean, it's not new for us to be using drones. So whether it's Reaper or something like that, we've been using drones for 10, 15 years, but they've always been really big platforms. What is happening now, I guess, and what Ukraine has shown us is just, and I mentioned that word before, innovative use of some of these systems. So you get a $1,000 DJI Mavic Pro or something like that, and strap a bomb to it, and that then becomes a extremely effective weapon. So I think this innovation side is going to change a lot of things very, very quickly.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that with some of these drones where in the past they've been able to block their signals, and now they're attaching a fiber optic to a drone, and sending that across into a territory that might be trying to interfere with comms, but you can't interfere with a fiber optic cable. So I guess the reality is, and we've seen this over a period of years, that where lives are at stake, there will be significant work done and an investment made to find new approaches to doing things. All right, that's probably our news topics over for the episode. Very keen to sort of delve into a bit of your story and what you're seeing out there in the cybersecurity world, Glenn. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what was your path into the world of cyber, and how you've ended up in your current role at Fortinet across Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, it's funny, like people as old as me didn't really have a path into cyber because it wasn't even a thing back then. So I sort of started out working for the Department of Defence in Australia, obviously in the mid-90s. I then sort of fell into cybersecurity in some of our national security organisations. So I sort of fell into cybersecurity in some of our defence intelligence and security organisations, and then grew up there for several years. I then left Defence and went to our tax office, and I was the IT security advisor for our tax office for about 4 years. So, and as you can imagine, that was sort of quite unique, trying to defend such an incredible database of the PII of every Australian at that scale. So, looking back now, it's actually, I'm quite proud that we were able to keep the integrity of such critical systems like that. But all my background in cyber and intelligence sort of led me through to now FortiGuard Labs, which is the threat intelligence component of Fortinet. For anyone that doesn't know, we're one of the biggest pure cybersecurity companies in the world. We've got we've got heaps and heaps of firewalls all throughout New Zealand. You don't have to look too far to find one, but we've actually got about 59 other products and if it's cybersecurity, we probably do it. But my organisation, FortiGuard Labs, is the threat intelligence component that sits behind all the capabilities of these products. So we go through the threat environment, we work with partners, we work with people like CERT New Zealand, pulling in as much information as we can and then turning that into some form of protection profile and then pushing that back out to the fleet of Fortinet devices and also partner devices. Obviously, we share a lot with partners as well. So I sort of fell into it a little bit, but it's sad. Maybe it's, I don't even know what the right word is, but it's a little bit sad. But unfortunately, in all my years, it's still the cyber threat has only grown. We haven't been able to squash it down as much as I would have liked.
Mm-hmm. And tell us about this role you've taken on with Crime Stoppers International, because there's a partnership between Fortinet and Crime Stoppers on a global basis, but you're also taken on wearing a pretty important hat for Crime Stoppers too.
No, and it's a role I'm absolutely proud of, Paul. So we started out about 6 months ago. My boss, his name's Derek Menke, so he's our global head of threat intelligence, and he's done some great work with partnerships. So he set up partnerships with Interpol, with World Economic Forum. Anyway, he sort of was sitting back probably about 12 months ago, and he just said, well, there's bug bounties, there's bounties for real criminals, real world criminals, but at the moment, most cyber criminals are getting away with it. So, we'll learn from the attacks and then build our defences better. But in terms of actually catching the bad guys, we still need to do much more. So Crime Stoppers was a natural partner there. They've got about Crime Stoppers International is the international component of Crime Stoppers, and then there's Crime Stoppers in 800, I think it is, jurisdictions around the world. Anyway, so they were a natural spot for us to sort of set up what we thought would be a cybercrime bounty program. And luckily for me is when I got handed this challenge by the boss, the CEO of Crime Stoppers International is actually she's an Australian, Hayley Van Loon, based out of Melbourne. So anyway, so we've been working closely with the CEO and with the rest of Crime Stoppers now for about 6 months to come up with this bounty program. It's initial operating capability right now. So if you know a cyber criminal that's operating outside of in your street or something like that, you can actually put in a tip, and we'll be starting to accept paid bounties from people soon. So if you know who one of our bounty targets is, you can go in, put the tip in, and then potentially get a juicy reward. So that's where it all started. But then the thing that I'm most excited about in terms of my Crime Stoppers international role is the way the law enforcement sort of look at cybercrime. They call it cyber-dependent crime and cyber-enabled crime. So cyber-dependent is your typical ransomware, your typical data breaches, those sort of things, and that's what I've been doing my whole career. But the cyber-enabled crime is the stuff that is the more horrible side of it. So this is human trafficking, this is a lot of smuggling, people smuggling, child sexual exploitation, all that horrible stuff. But a lot of these criminals now are run by global organised crime gangs, and counting that they're using some of that same infrastructure for the cyber-dependent crime and cyber-enabled crime. So by joining up with Crime Stoppers, I'm hoping we can join the few dots and make some very, very horrible people's days very, very, very bad. That's that's my plan anyway.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I think it's a big challenge, and we've got to pull out all the stops to address these challenges.
Well, the good thing is, like, there's companies like Fortinet, and we work with the other big companies, but not for profits like Crime Stoppers. There's so many. You hear all these horrible stories, but there's so many people doing the best, trying to bring a little bit of good to the world. So I think with any luck, we'll start to see a few wins on the scorecard over the next few months.
Yeah, good. Well, definitely keep us appraised on that front. Now, you see things that probably would shock people, and you get access to information that isn't necessarily getting talked about every day. Now, some of that will tend to float through in the varying reports that are released. We have the 2026 threat landscape report that has come through from Fortinet. What can you share with us around the key cyber threats right now, and what are maybe those that people maybe not quite so familiar with, but really starting to come onto the radar?
I think I'm not going to answer this the way maybe you expected, but I think there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of fear, uncertainty and doubt certainly in the market at the moment. There was a survey done by one of the big consulting companies, and it was about what the CISOs across then they surveyed so many CISOs. There was probably thousands of them, and what was their greatest concerns and what was where were they planning on spending their money in the next 12 months.
Yeah.
And I looked at what their greatest concerns were, and I looked at where they were going to spend their money, and both those things didn't add up for me. So while we'll say, as in Fortinet, we'll say that the speed of these attacks is getting quicker. For sure, it is. The attackers are getting better at what they do. For sure, they are in some components, but I think the biggest I guess concern from me is not a 100% turnaround in the threat. I mean, the threat has been getting incrementally, I guess, more severe every year, and that's getting quicker and quicker. But the most important thing for me is having good decision for defenders, blue side, and making sure that they're proactive in their defensive architectures. And I think that's the way that we win. We need to make sure that we're understanding what the threat is, becoming, I guess, a little bit more comfortable with getting a breach. So I think we're at the stage now where it's inevitable that we're going to get a breach of our organisation somewhere. But we need, as board members, as C-suite, as anyone in cybersecurity, to say, well, I need to do everything in my power to make sure that when I get that breach, that as rapidly as possible I've identified it, I've contained it, I've remediated it, and I've made sure that the impact of that breach is absolutely minimised. And there's some, I've got 60 products that we can sell you today that will help you do that. It's just a matter of getting in front of that threat and getting some of those layered defence systems installed and deployed quickly.
Yeah. It's I guess that old adage of it, it's not, if you're going to be impacted by a cyber incident, it's when.
Yes.
And being prepared, as you say, so you really can minimise that. And I think that's something I'm concerned about for New Zealand, especially because of the reality that from the government down, we probably still don't fully have our heads around the cyber risks that exist today and the fact that they are fast moving and are not reducing. Things are on the increase, and we have so many sort of mid-size and smaller organisations in New Zealand where cyber isn't necessarily something that's the first thing that people think about. And then, you've got a government situation where there's not enough money to go around the different areas. And, cyber certainly gets attention and there's great work going on from the government front. But are we where we should be as a country? Are we investing enough? Yeah, probably not. And I think getting the awareness front and centre of mind. This has been a journey over a long period. I think, the first interview I did sort of on TV is probably 15 years ago, talking about the very early sort of ransomware that was coming through, and yet I was talking to a producer with our main public radio broadcaster today. And I realised that some of the absolute basics from a cybersecurity point of view are still not deeply embedded in how we operate as a New Zealand population. And I've had multiple discussions around the basics of things like multi-factor authentication, and that was part of the discussion that we had about a future segment today. And you realise, wow, even though there's companies like Fortinet, there's folks like me, there's lots of people that are trying to nudge us forward. We're still kind of a long way off where we should be.
It is tough. I mean, I think Australia is probably similar to New Zealand, maybe a little bit of difference, but in terms of the 90% of the economy being a small business of 20 people or less, like it definitely creates some challenges. And I was actually just reading up today. So in Australia, we just introduced some mandatory reporting for ransomware. The trouble with that is there's a threshold of you've got to be making $3 million or more, or you have to be a critical infrastructure owner. And then you have to report. But if you think of us, like those people that you're talking about, the people that I'm talking about, a lot of those companies are not making $3 million or more. And even if they're not critical infrastructure, maybe they are actually providing essential. So maybe they're building the bolts that go into some critical infrastructure. So either way, it's still going to hurt. So I think, to start off with, there's a massive gap in terms of our visibility. And in Australia, where we've actually made it law to try and get better visibility, there's a massive gap in us seeing how impacted some of these segments are. We're not reporting it. We don't know. So that gives us almost zero clarity on how to address the problem. And then, as you say, like some of these smaller organisations, it's hard to be critical and just say, well, you haven't got MFA or, your password was password 123. It's hard to be critical when, it might be a hairdresser, or it might be a builder, or it might be a bricklayer, that has not touched cybersecurity in their life. So, so how do we solve that? And here's where I think I'll get a little bit optimistic because I do sort of get around New Zealand a little bit. There is some absolutely brilliant, world-leading cybersecurity talent in this country. Like almost everyone I meet is good or above. So I think if we can, and there's also some really, really good managed services providers. including Fortinet. So, if people need some cybersecurity advice, go and knock on your nearest Fortinet door and you'll get that good advice. But I think what's happened up until now, the challenge, at least to my mind, has always been, how can you have like really good bleeding edge cybersecurity technology, like something that we would be able to sell, but then how do we make sure that it's viable for a business then to be able to scale that out to maybe 100 of these small 20 people or less companies? And I think that's where AI is going to be our friend. So, we can actually start to deliver really good quality visibility, incident management, incident response type services to a much broader swath of the New Zealand business community.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that AI element is something that people are really interested in. Do you see that AI shifts the balance more in the direction of protecting organisations, or more in the protection of the cyber criminals, or is that something that's going to vary over time?
It might be like this. FIFA World Cup at the moment, Paul. But where I've seen the true, I guess, where the cyber criminals have grown absolutely incredibly in the last couple of years is in the pre-exploitation phase of a breach. So this is just before they managed to get that first toehold into our networks. And that's all about really, really authentic social engineering, really, really good bait, deep fakes. So we're at the stage now where any one bait, whether it's an email, whether it's a Teams call or something like that, whatever the bait happens to be, it is going to be so compelling that 99% of us can't tell the difference between what's legitimate and what's fake. So that changes the game. But again, to put the glass half full perspective on that, we still have a lot of ability to minimize damage with all the other defense in-depth controls we can have if we assume that this most brilliant attack is going to be successful against one employee in our organization. They're going to click, or they're going to fill in a form, or they're going to do something. If we make sure that initial component of the breach is about as far as they can go, and that's where we've got really good the technology. It's not a technology problem. There's technology that can limit that all the way through. Then we can get to the point where we make it really, really difficult for the most part cyber criminals to make any money.
Now, before we wrap up, I think folks would be interested in hearing, what have we seen when it comes to warfare recently, particularly what's been going on in the Middle East. What really stands out in terms of how, for instance, cyber things being attacked that maybe not everyone is aware of in this sort of current wartime type situation.
So I can give you 3 learnings. I started watching this really, really carefully when Russia invaded Ukraine a few years ago now. But there's 3 things that really stand out to me. One is just how embedded cybersecurity attacks or cyber attacks have become in what we would call the order of battle. So a cyber weapon now is used just as indiscriminately as kinetic weapon. So, and again, we've seen that. I've watched the campaigns that's happened in Ukraine. I've seen the cyber attacks line up incredibly well with the movement of troops and other infrastructure on the ground. So, cyber is now, besides being a tool for cyber criminals to use to make money, is absolutely in the toolbox, the war toolbox of nation states. So it will be used, it will be easy. And when you think about the context of Australia and New Zealand, it's not limited by geography like a missile or a bullet is. So, we are absolutely exposed with our critical infrastructure sectors. So that was sort of part 1. Part 2 is, if you look at just more recently in the Iranian invasion, the Amazon data center just across the border, I think it was in Kuwait, you probably know better than I do.
Drone and missile strikes targeting AWS data centers in both UAE and Bahrain. So
this was one of the first targets that the Iranians retaliated against was this data center. So it wasn't an area where there was troops. It wasn't a hangar where there was jet planes. There wasn't a port where there was either Israeli or American ships. It was a data center. So that when we go back to our earlier discussion, what does that actually mean if that data center was providing critical infrastructure services for that country. So that was absolutely a legitimate target.
This is not something that we think about every day, and it's probably not something that most Kiwis are thinking about either. But if there was a war situation that was directly impacting New Zealand, then hey, what would that mean for infrastructure, whether it's in Auckland, whether it ends up in Invercargill? What would it mean for our fibre optic connectivity to the rest of the world?
Well, that comes back to my third point. So when we saw the conflict break out in Gaza, almost every hacktivist or issue-motivated group activity that we've been tracking in FortiGuard for the last 12 months is somehow related to that conflict. And I've seen instances here in New Zealand, also in Australia, where major organisations have been targeted as a result of the perception of which side they sit on in this conflict that's on the other side of the world. So, for us to sit down in our little corner of the world and just say, well, that's a long way from me, it's got nothing to do with me. There's other people, whether they're criminals, whether they're issue-motivated individuals, or whether they're a hostile nation state that don't see it the same way we do. So we are absolutely a target.
Mm-hmm. And we've seen real world impacts on the subsea cables as well, haven't we? So these things are not just a fictitious idea. It's reality that these assets are considered significant when it comes to war. Well, anything else that you wanted to add, Glenn, before we wrap up?
I would like to try and at least not leave it quite as negative as I guess my last comment. But I do think if we can understand where our business is, where our risks are placed, and who maybe might be interested in making my life a little bit miserable. So whether that's a ransomware person trying to kill my availability, or whether that's someone else trying to steal some sensitive data, it's not necessarily. There's not necessarily the requirement to go and invest huge amounts of money to buy the latest security capability. There is some really good ways that we can lift our resilience very, very quickly. Just understanding, having an incident response plan that works, understanding that we've got a backup that we can restore from, how long we can afford to be offline. So some of that stuff people are already doing, but our evidence shows that they're doing it bad. So just getting that sort of dusted off, updated for 2026 and exercised importantly is one. But from a technology perspective, as I said before, there's some really good MSPs that certainly Fortinet work with in this country, some of the best in the world. They're able to help. And from a technology perspective, there's some really good bang for the buck technologies. You mentioned MFA before. That will make it. It's not perfect like everything. I think that's one of the problems.
Part of the picture, isn't it? Each of these elements.
Like I think that's when you mentioned before, we're still not getting it right. I think the problem is we always think that we can just have one silver bullet that's going to make us secure. It's not. But there's a few things that we can do that can make us considerably harder. So I don't want everyone just to sort of throw in the towel and go home. There is absolutely a way to face this threat, even in 2026.
Yeah, good. Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us on the show, Glenn Maiden.
Thank you for having me.
Much appreciated. And, we're certainly very grateful for the support and, of course, across all our partners. So, yeah, big thank you to PwC, Fortinet, Workday, One New Zealand, 2 Degrees Spark, and Gorilla Technology. And, of course, if you've been listening into the audio for the show, make sure you're also following us on the likes of YouTube for the video. And, of course, if you've been watching the video, make sure you follow us on your favourite audio platform as well. That's us for this week, and we'll look forward to catching up with everyone again next week. And if you've got any feedback or any ideas for the show, we would love to hear from you. We are going through a few quiet changes in the background that you may notice as we work to iterate on the New Zealand Tech Podcast. Thanks again, Glenn, and thanks everyone for listening in.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.